Hi, and welcome to the 8th session in our series, Conversation Analysis and Healthcare Interactions. Today, we're going to be taking a look at preference organization. And before we get into it, as ever, here are the reading materials that we're using for this session and in our later discussion session. Now for today, we're going to be examining the core topic of preference organization in social interactions. So by the end of today's session, you should be able to identify some of the bases of preference organization. You should be able to describe the relationship between conversational actions and preference organization. And you should be able to understand some of the complexities and limitations inherent to this topic. During the later live session, we'll have 2 discussion rounds to address our key questions. And during these rounds, as ever, participation is always welcome and encouraged, but is always going to be voluntary. The skip turn will always remain a valid choice. And having your PDFs open during the sessions will always be helpful. So before we move on, let's take a quick look at what we covered in the previous session. First of all, we examined multimodal analysis and its importance for a better understanding of social interactions. We identified the importance of offering an analysis of vocal and non-vocal modalities, and we learned about embodied conduct in relation to pain during clinical consultations. For today, we're going to take a look at preference organization, and in particular, how these can be identified through an analysis of initiating and responding actions. For this, it's worth quickly recapping the concept of adjacency pairs in social interaction. Now, Harvey Sachs initially described this as the nextness of talk, as he noticed what he described as reflexive relationships between certain pairs of terns. In this noticing, Sachs described how certain pairs of terns seem to be typically produced one after the other. And this led to the concept of the adjacency pair, 2 terns produced by different participants that are normatively related. These pairs are then produced in a particular order of a first pair part followed by a second pair part. And specifically, the production of the first pair part places affordances and constraints upon the production of the second pair part. And it's in these affordances and constraints in adjacency pairs that we might get some indication of preference organization. In adjacency pairs, there are certain amounts of flexibility in how actions are initiated, as well as the ways that people respond to these initiating actions. In everyday social conduct, certain actions are regarded as more favourable or preferred. And when I say preferred, this relates to a social organisation and the understanding of these actions. And like CA in general, this does not relate to internal or solo cognitions. Now, some of the background work that led to this core topic is related to the drive for social solidarity in everyday conduct. Brown and Levinson proposed that interaction is influenced by 2 basic human desires, which they conceptualized as face concerns: positive face and negative face. Negative face relates to the basic desire of being free from the imposition of others, while positive face relates to the basic desire for affirmation or validation from others. Both of these have implications for social actions, particularly in initiating actions such as requests, offers, assessments, and so on. For example, making a request can make an imposition upon the recipient. This may be seen as a threat to negative face. By contrast, an offer can pose a risk to positive face. That is to say, having your offer validated by others. Now, here are some examples of initiating actions that can have face implications. In making an offer, a recipient can accept, which can be seen as a validation of a person making the offer, or they can otherwise decline it. In making an invitation, a recipient can accept or refuse with the same implications. And the same goes for evaluations, where a recipient can agree or disagree. And in these, both the initiating action and response can present a risk to social solidarity and have implications for face, as described by Brown and Levinson. Now, what we're going to look at first is somewhat counterintuitively second actions, the second pair part of an adjacency pair. And this is because in analysis, the second action is a good place to look for indications of preference organization. When a second action is performed in alignment with the preference organization of the initiating turn, that is to say, a preferred response, it's performed in a particular way. Typically, the response is prompt, with little or no gap from the transition point of the initiating turn, and sometimes with a little bit of overlap. The response is usually direct and straightforward and doesn't need to come packaged with an explanatory account. By contrast, when a second action is performed out of alignment with the preference organization of an initiating turn, it typically comes packaged with some notable features. The response is usually delayed. It includes typically some form of preface and is usually a qualified response that comes embedded with some form of explanatory account. Here are a few examples that might make that description a little bit clearer. In this excerpt, we have a polar question as the initiating action. In this excerpt, speaker A says, "They have a good cook there." The pause on line 2, although not timed, was evidently hearable enough to transcribe. Pauses like these tend to project that the incoming response is not going to be in alignment with the initiating action, or in short, a dispreferred action. And in line 3, the speaker A, reformulates the polar question, offering up a reformulated question with a candidate response. Nothing special. And it's then that speaker B responds, now able to offer an affirming response to speaker A's question from line 3. This is an example of an invitation sequence. B is inviting A over for a cup of coffee over lines 1 and 2. The response across lines 3 to 5 has some notable features. It opens with a preface that begins with "well." Now, well-prefaced turns have been described as projecting a turn that is not in alignment with the prior, or at least has some kind of complicated relationship with it. In this case, the preface leads to what could be described as a weak refusal. "I don't think I can make it this morning." Following this, A offers an explanatory account for declining the invitation. In this example, Jean initiates their turn on line 1 with an inquiry that is a prelude to an invitation. This is a pre-invitation. On line 2, there is a 0.4 second gap, which is long enough to be identified by all participants. On line 3, Mary's turn is transcribed with a long in-breath. Combined with the gap on line 2, that indicates a substantial gap, and it's apparent that Jean identifies this as indicative of an incoming dispreferred response. On line 4, Jean reformulates the query with, "Are you working nights?" And this reformulation enables Mary to produce an affirming response relative to this reformulated query. And these preludes to a focus action, or pre-sequences, can also offer a good illustration of preference organization. A pre-sequence can serve to minimize the risk of receiving a dispreferred response, such as a rejection to an invitation. In this sequence, Nelson initiates with a pre-invitation. What you doing? This is a kind of conversational fishing exercise. On line 2, Claire responds with not much. Now, while this is a fairly straightforward response, it does more than provide a conditionally relevant second pair part. This can also serve as a go-ahead for the focus action. And this allows Nelson to initiate this as an invitation. And this arrives on line 3. The invitation is delivered with elisions that serve to mitigate the importance of the invitation. You want a drink? The response is a straightforward, typed interjection. Yeah. There's no delay, there's no preface, and there's no account. On line 5, Nelson closes this sequence with an acknowledgement. Okay. Now we'll take a look at how the initiating action can be used. As well as being able to identify preference organization in second actions, the initiating turn can also be seen as highly organized in orientation to the normative expectations of a given action. For example, requests are often performed with prefaces, hesitance markers, and accounts for the request. And more than this, requests can sometimes be performed in subtle ways that make the request implicit, with turns that are designed instead to elicit an offer. In this excerpt, we find a protracted example of how preference organization can be identified through an analysis of initiating actions. From lines 1 to 12, Donnie makes an implicit request for help through the stepwise news delivery items, with each turn at talk edging towards a focal action. The closest that Donnie gets to making the explicit request is in line 11 with the I don't know if it's possible, but see, I have to open up the bank, which can be seen as anticipating an upcoming rejection. And this might be related to the fact that there's very little uptake from Marcia over lines 2 to 10. Then Donnie continues, offering a prefacing account with, see, I have to open up the bank in Brentwood. And it's then in lines 15 to 17 that Marcia performs the rejection in ways that can be seen as indicative of the overall preference organization of a request sequence. Marcia's turn has hesitance markers, self-repairs, reinitiations, a preface, and an account, but does not have an explicit rejection. So, without an explicit request or an explicit rejection, this sequence can be analysed as featuring both through an understanding of preference organisation. However, it's not all straightforward, and preference organisation is not necessarily situation invariant. That is to say, the practice can vary greatly depending on the context, and it's apparent that preference organisation can be seen as highly contextually bound, whether it's a product of the relationship between the participants, the sequential position of the adjacency pair, the conversational setting, or even the cultural norms within which the conversation is taking place. Preference organisation is complicated. For example, in making an evaluative statement about something, there is a general preference for agreement. But this becomes complicated when the evaluation is a personal compliment, that is to say, a positive evaluation of your conversational partner. Personal compliments conflict with the typical preference organisation of evaluations. And this conflict shows that preference organisation is situation dependent and not situation invariant. To highlight the difference, this is a straightforward adjacency pair. In line 1, you have an evaluation. It stands alone in reference to the beautiful day. The turn design offers the evaluation up for approval. In line 2, the approval is not only granted, but it's provided with an upgraded response that not only is in alignment with the preference organization of the evaluation, but projects a degree of agency on the part of this participant who becomes more active in the construction of this evaluation. This upgraded assessment performs a very different action when compared to a more weak approval of yes it is or just yes. In the case of compliments, the situation is different. Responding to compliments is a complicated activity because there are two cross-cutting preferences at work. In responding to a compliment, participants tend to want to work to minimize disagreement, which relates to the ongoing drive for social solidarity. But at the same time, participants work to minimize self-praise insofar as they typically don't want to be seen as self-serving or even arrogant. And in the face of a compliment, these two preferences come into conflict. And what we typically see is that personal compliments are met with these hedged responses along with downgraded versions of the same evaluation. The downgraded assessment works in two ways. It doesn't disagree with the initial assessment, but it's also a form of self-deprecation. In essence, the downgrade straddles the line, offering an agreement with the assessment while projecting a response that is not overtly self-promoting. And there are several ways that preference organization can be seen as highly situation dependent. This video clip offers a great example of culturally situated practices and how they relate to preference organization of offers. Now, I'll not offer a point by point on this one, but instead, I think the video clip speaks for itself.
Would you like a slice of cake?
Oh my god, that looks delicious. No, I couldn't possibly. No, stop.
Just have a nice look. Be a little bit naughty.
No,
Go on.
no. Oh,
Take it.
fine, you're forcing my hand. Okay, fine, I'll take it. Kuchen? Ja, bitte.
Bitteschön.
Dankeschön.
Kuchen?
Oh my goodness, that looks delicious. No, I couldn't possibly have a slice of it. Wait.
Would you like a slice of cake?
Oh, ja, bitte.
Oh, okay. You're very confident. A bit rude, really.
Now, just ahead of the examination of our focus paper, I want to outline some of the ways in which preference organization can be identified in turn design. The design of polar questions, questions that typically require a yes or no response, can serve to mobilize certain responses over others. The turn design can construct a preference as a function of grammar. So, are you going to the meeting is typically valenced for yes. You can add a tagged question to a statement, which makes the normative response more explicit, such as, "You're going to the meeting, aren't you?" Then, there are social preferences that tilt the question in a particular direction, such as, "Are you taking any painkillers?" which is tilted towards no due to turn design and social norms. And then there are some cross-cutting preferences where the socially organized preference conflicts with the turn design, such as in adversarial exchanges. For example, "Aren't you encouraging racism?" Now, this is more of an accusatory turn performed as a polar question, which would typically be designed to favor for a yes response, but this can also be seen as more of a challenge to the recipient to accept or to deny. In short, preference organization is highly complicated. Now, with that said, we're going to take a look at our focus paper, which is distinct in several ways. This paper, while a conversation analytic paper, at its core uses coding, experimental conditions, and statistical analysis to demonstrate how a shift in a conversational practice in healthcare settings can have a measurable impact on health outcomes, specifically the reduction in unmet patient needs. Now, in this paper, they examined primary care consultations for patients with more than one concern as established by a pre-consultation survey. In the analysis, the paper focuses on the doctor's initiating turn that is designed to solicit additional concerns. Doctors were assigned to two distinct conditions. In one, the doctor asked a question such as, "Is there anything else you want to discuss?" This was described as the any condition. And in the other, doctors were asked to ask a question such as, "Is there something else you want to address?" And this was called the some condition. The paper reports that the some condition reduced unmet concerns by 78%. Now, the underlying basis of this research relates to the preference organization of polar questions. Specifically, the research focuses on the turn design of initiating actions and the polarity of the target word being used. When asking a polar question, the word any has been shown to have an implicit negative valence. It leans the question towards a negative response. On the other hand, some has been shown to have an implicit positive valence, which leans the question towards a positive response. And while this has been shown in everyday conversation, this paper offered evidence for the concept in healthcare interactions and demonstrated the clinical utility in understanding these practices and, in the words of the paper, the difference that a single word can make. And with that, here are the key questions that we're going to address in our later live session. Thanks for watching.